A black judge walks into her own courtroom, dressed casually. The white security guards don't recognize her, and they forcefully kick her out, thinking she doesn't belong. 2 minutes later, she returns in her robe, takes her seat at the bench, and fires every single one of them. But what happens next is even more shocking, because that moment uncovers years of buried racism, hidden complaints, and a secret power struggle inside the courthouse that no one saw coming. Why were they so quick to remove her? And what did they think they were protecting? This isn't just about one judge. It's about a system that never thought she'd fight back. Until now. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Judge Leanna Brooks stirred at the gentle chime of her 5:30 a.m. alarm. The soft blue light of dawn hadn't yet touched her bedroom window. She lay still for a moment, letting her mind settle on the weight of the day ahead. Police brutality cases were never easy, but they were necessary, especially in a system that often seemed designed to protect its own. Her feet found their way into warm slippers as she padded across the hardwood floors of her modest 2-bedroom apartment. The space wasn't fancy, but it was home. Family photos lined the walls, mixed with her law school diploma and a treasured picture of her grandmother, who'd worked as a housekeeper in this very courthouse 60 years ago. In the kitchen, Leanna's hands moved through their familiar morning ritual. She scooped fresh coffee beans into the grinder, the rich aroma filling the air as she pressed the button. While the coffee maker hummed to life, she pulled out her worn leather notebook and spread her materials across the small breakfast nook. "Officer James Peterson," she murmured, reviewing her notes from the previous evening. The case file was thick with incident reports and witness statements. Her handwritten notes covered 3 pages in neat, precise script. She'd learned early in her career that writing things by hand helped cement the details in her mind. The coffee maker beeped. Leanna poured the steaming liquid into her favorite mug, a gift from her mother when she passed the bar exam. "For my girl who's going to change the world," the inscription read. Some days those words felt like a promise, other days like a burden. She gathered her thick, natural hair, carefully working it into a neat bun. No matter how many years passed, she could still hear her mother's voice. "They're going to look at you twice as hard, baby. Make sure they see excellence." The routine was comforting, each movement precise and purposeful. Instead of her usual business attire, Leanna pulled on a pair of well-worn jeans and a navy hoodie. Her judicial robe and a crisp white blouse hung in a garment bag, along with her court shoes. Early mornings like this were her secret weapon. Time to think, to prepare, to center herself before the courthouse filled with its usual bustle. The drive through the quiet city streets gave her time to mentally review the case. Officer Peterson had been caught on camera using excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The victim was a 17-year-old honor student. The footage was clear, the injuries documented, but these cases were never simple. They carried the weight of history, of systemic issues larger than any single courtroom. Leanna pulled into her reserved parking spot at 6:40 a.m. The courthouse was a massive stone building, its classical columns reaching up into the pre-dawn sky. Her grandmother used to tell stories about polishing these same marble steps, about entering through the back door because that's what was expected then. Now Leanna climbed those steps every day in her own right, carrying the hopes and sacrifices of those who came before her. The early morning air was crisp as she made her way up the courthouse steps, her garment bag draped over one shoulder, briefcase in the other hand. Her sensible sneakers were quiet on the marble floors of the empty hallway. The building had a different feeling at this hour, peaceful, almost sacred. Mr. Clarence, the elderly janitor, was buffing the floor near her courtroom. He'd been working here longer than anyone could remember, and his silent presence was as much a part of the building as the marble columns outside. "Morning, Mr. Clarence," Leanna said softly. He looked up and gave his characteristic nod, a gesture that contained both respect and understanding. They were both early birds. Both knew what it meant to navigate these halls as people of color, though in very different ways. Leanna used her key to enter through the side door of her courtroom. The room was dark except for the ambient light filtering through the tall windows. She didn't turn on the overhead lights yet, preferring the quiet darkness. The American flag hung still in the corner, and the empty jury box waited for the day to begin. She settled into the front pew rather than her usual place on the bench. These quiet moments helped her think, helped her remember that before she was Judge Brooks, she was Liana, a girl from the South Side who believed in justice even when justice seemed blind to people who looked like her. She pulled out her thermos of coffee and her notes, spreading them on the wooden pew beside her. The familiar scent of coffee and old wood filled her nostrils as she reviewed the key points of today's proceedings. The sound of footsteps broke her concentration, heavy, deliberate steps that didn't belong to Mr. Clarence's familiar shuffle. Liana looked up to see an unfamiliar bailiff in the doorway. His badge read, Carter, and his stance was rigid, almost confrontational. He stopped abruptly upon seeing her, then began walking toward where she sat in the pew. His face showed confusion mixed with something else, something that made Liana sit up straighter, though she kept her expression neutral. Carter's footsteps echoed through the quiet courtroom as he approached, his badge gleaming under the dim morning light. His stocky frame cast a shadow across Liana's papers, and his face wore the expression of someone who'd caught a trespasser. At around 55, with close-cropped gray hair and shoulders like a retired linebacker, he carried himself with the self-assured authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Court staff only," he barked, not bothering with a greeting. His eyes swept over her hoodie and jeans with obvious dismissal. Public entrance opens at 8:30. Liana maintained her composure, decades of experience helping her keep her voice steady and professional. "I'm Judge Brooks. This is my courtroom." Carter's laugh came out as a harsh bark. "Sure you are." His arms crossed over his chest, and he planted his feet wider, taking up more space. "And I'm the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court." With deliberate movements, Liana reached into her bag and retrieved her judge's identification card. The photo was recent, showing her in her judicial robes, her signature neat and clear below. She held it up for Carter to see, her hand steady. Carter barely glanced at the ID before waving it away. That could be fake. Anyone can print something like that these days. His jaw clenched, and his hand moved to rest on his radio. "You need to leave. Now." "I assure you, Officer Carter, this identification is genuine." Liana kept her tone measured, though her heart had begun to beat faster. She recognized the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, that mixture of authority and assumption that had nothing to do with actual law and everything to do with who he thought belonged where. Without taking his eyes off her, Carter raised his radio to his mouth. "Security to courtroom 4B. Suspicious person refusing to leave." His voice crackled through the quiet space, each word deliberate and heavy with implied threat. Liana remained seated, her posture straight but relaxed. She folded her hands in her lap, her mother's voice echoing in her head. "Never let them see you sweat, baby." The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the edge of her coffee cup, still steaming quietly beside her notes. Within minutes, the side door burst open and 3 security officers entered. They moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out as they approached. Officer Harrington, his name badge catching the light, had his hand resting on his taser, his fingers twitching slightly. "Gentlemen," Liana said, her voice carrying the authority she'd earned through years on the bench, "I am Judge Liana Brooks. You are about to make a career-ending decision." The warning seemed to float in the air between them, clear and precise as a bell tone, but none of the officers acknowledged it. Carter jerked his head toward her, and 2 of the officers moved forward. They positioned themselves on either side of her, close enough that she could smell their coffee breath and standard-issue cologne. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the officer on her left said, his hand reaching for her elbow. Liana stood before they could touch her, gathering her dignity around her like armor. She picked up her briefcase and coffee cup with steady hands, letting them guide her toward the side corridor. Their footsteps echoed off the wooden panels, a synchronized march that seemed to mock the solemnity of the space. They didn't use force, they didn't need to. The message was clear in every step, every gesture, every unspoken assumption. This was power in its most basic form, stripped of pretense or procedure. They escorted her through the side corridor, past the empty jury room, past the conference rooms where she'd held countless chambers meetings. When they reached the hallway, they released their loose formation around her, stepping back as if to distance themselves from what they'd just done. Liana stood alone in the marble corridor, her coffee cup still warm in her hand, her case files tucked securely under her arm. She drew in a deep breath and released it slowly, feeling the air move through her body, carrying with it decades of similar moments, similar assumptions, similar battles. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, freshly polished by Mr. Clarence's careful work. Without a word, she turned and walked to her chambers, her sneakers silent on the polished floor. Inside, she closed the door softly behind her and moved to her private bathroom. The familiar space welcomed her with its simple dignity: a small mirror, a hook for her robe, a shelf with an extra tube of lipstick. She changed methodically, efficiently. The hoodie and jeans were replaced by her pressed white blouse and black skirt. She stepped into her heels, the height adding to her natural presence. The judicial robe settled over her shoulders like a second skin, its weight both familiar and significant. Liana uncapped her lipstick, maple rose, the same shade she'd worn to her swearing-in ceremony. She applied it carefully, precisely, the color rich and professional against her dark skin. In the mirror, Judge Liana Brooks looked back at her, every inch the authority she had earned the right to be. Exactly 2 minutes after being escorted out, she opened her chamber doors and walked back toward her courtroom. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step a declaration, each echo a reminder of how far she'd come, and how far there was still to go. The heavy courtroom doors swung open with quiet authority as Judge Brooks entered. Her black robe billowed slightly with each measured step, the fabric a stark contrast against the polished wood panels of the courtroom walls. The morning light streaming through the high windows caught the silver threads in her precisely arranged bun, making them shimmer like strands of steel. The 4 men stood in a loose circle near the bailiff's station, their postures relaxed and informal. Carter's laugh bounced off the walls, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "Can you believe it? Walking in here like she owned the place?" "In jeans, no less," Officer Deeks added, shaking his head. "These people get bolder every day." "Probably saw it in some TV show," Raymond chimed in, leaning against the wooden railing. Harrington wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "Man, the look on her face when—" The laughter died abruptly as the click of Judge Brooks's heels registered. 4 heads turned simultaneously, and 4 faces transformed from amusement to shock in the span of a heartbeat. Carter's smile melted away like ice in summer, leaving behind a pallid complexion that made his ruddy features stand out even more starkly. Harrington's mouth worked soundlessly, his hand frozen halfway to his face. "Is this—" he stammered, unable to complete the thought as realization crashed over him like a wave. Judge Brooks moved purposefully toward the bench, each step deliberate and measured. Her face remained composed, but her eyes held the weight of every similar encounter she'd experienced throughout her career. The room had fallen so silent that the soft rustle of her robe seemed thunderous. She ascended the steps to her chair with fluid grace, settling into position with the practiced ease of someone who had earned their place 1,000 times over. The height of the bench allowed her to look down at the assembled officers, though she hardly needed the additional elevation to command the space. "Officers Harrington, Deeks, Raymond," her voice filled the courtroom with quiet authority. "Bailiff Carter." She paused, letting each name land with precise impact. "Step forward." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Carter's jaw worked back and forth, as if chewing on words he didn't dare speak. They remained rooted in place. Their earlier bravado evaporated in the face of actual authority. "That was not a request," Judge Brooks added, her tone unchanged but somehow carrying even more weight. They shuffled forward, their boots scuffing against the carpet. Harrington's hand had moved from his face to his belt, though his fingers no longer strayed toward his taser. Raymond's eyes darted toward the exit, while Deeks seemed fascinated by the pattern in the carpet at his feet. "You are hereby terminated from court service," Judge Brooks announced, each word clear and distinct. "Effective immediately." Harrington's head snapped up, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, you can't just—" Would you like to add perjury to your record today? She cut through his protest like a laser through fog, her gaze fixed on him with unwavering intensity. I'm certain you remember the events of the past 30 minutes quite clearly. Shall we discuss them under oath? Harrington's mouth snapped shut. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool morning air. Judge Brooks lifted her hand slightly, and 2 internal affairs officers appeared from the side entrance. They moved with quiet efficiency, their badges catching the light as they approached the group. These officers will escort you to process your termination, she continued, her voice never rising above its measured tone. You will surrender your credentials and clear out your lockers. Any personal items will be inspected before removal. Carter's face had progressed from pale to mottled red, but he remained silent as one of the internal affairs officers gestured for him to move toward the door. The 4 men filed out in a line, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. As they passed the gallery, now filling with early arrivals for the day's proceedings, a young black female attorney in a crisp navy suit leaned slightly toward her colleague. She really did that, she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of awe and satisfaction. Judge Brooks picked up her gavel, its wooden handle warm and familiar in her grip. She surveyed her courtroom, noting the mix of expressions on the faces before her: surprise, respect, and in some cases, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. Court is now in session, she announced, her gavel striking the sound block with practiced precision. Please be seated. We will proceed with case number 2023 CR 405, State versus Matthews. The rustle of papers and movement of bodies filled the courtroom as everyone settled into their places. Judge Brooks opened the case file before her, her reading glasses perched perfectly on her nose, and began reviewing the morning's first case with the same thorough attention she had given every case for the past 15 years. By 11 that morning, the courthouse hummed with barely contained excitement. The morning's events had spread through the building's 7 floors like wildfire, carried in hushed tones between court clerks who ducked their heads together in elevators and defense attorneys who exchanged meaningful glances in the hallways. Even the usually chatty cafeteria had taken on a library-like atmosphere, conversations conducted in careful whispers over coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches. In Courtroom 4A, Judge Brooks continued her docket with methodical precision. She called each case, listened to arguments, and delivered rulings with the same measured attention she always showed. To anyone watching, she appeared completely unaffected by the morning's confrontation, but her clerks knew better. Sarah, her senior clerk, noticed how the judge's fingers lingered a fraction longer on each document before passing it along. Marcus, the junior clerk, caught the slight pause before each time she called a new case, a barely perceptible moment of collection that hadn't been there before. These tiny details spoke volumes to those who knew her best. The morning's cases proceeded: a property dispute, 2 preliminary hearings, and a sentencing that took longer than expected. Judge Brooks handled each one with her characteristic thoroughness, but there was a new tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there at 6:40 that morning. Between cases, the whispers continued. A court reporter from the 3rd floor slipped into the back row, ostensibly checking her phone but clearly there to observe. 2 judges from other divisions found reasons to pass by the open courtroom doors, their casual glances anything but casual. Did you hear about Courtroom 4A? Carter's gone? All 4 of them. Just like that? The whispers followed Judge Brooks like shadows, but she gave no indication she heard them. She simply continued her work, her voice clear and steady as she addressed each attorney, defendant, and witness who came before her bench. At her desk, Sarah fielded 3 calls from other judges' chambers, all making subtle inquiries about the morning's events. She deflected each one with professional courtesy, neither confirming nor denying anything. Marcus caught himself checking the side door more often than usual, as if expecting another confrontation at any moment. By the time they broke for lunch, the tension in Judge Brooks's shoulders had traveled down to her hands. She gripped her pen just a bit too tightly as she made notes on her last morning case. Her usual lunch routine, a quiet half hour with a sandwich and case files, was interrupted when Frank Denlow appeared in her chambers. He didn't knock. The heavy door swung open with the confidence of someone who had never been taught to question his right to enter any room in the building. Frank's broad frame filled the doorway, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the late morning hour. His smile was wide and practiced, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "Liana," he said, using her first name with calculated familiarity. "I just heard quite the scene this morning." He closed the door behind him, muffling the constant hum of courthouse activity. Judge Brooks set down her pen with deliberate care. She said nothing, her silence filling the room with more authority than any words could have managed. Frank's smile didn't waver as he lowered himself into one of the chairs facing her desk. He smoothed his tie, silk, probably more expensive than a week's salary for most court employees. "Look, we all know how these things can get blown out of proportion. A simple misunderstanding, really." Still, Judge Brooks remained silent. Her dark eyes studied Frank's face with the same careful attention she gave to complex legal arguments in her courtroom. "Carter's been with us for what, 15 years?" Frank continued, his tone suggesting reasonable compromise. "Good record, overall. Steady. Reliable." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a confidential tone. "Perhaps we could reconsider the terminations. A suspension, maybe some sensitivity training." Judge Brooks finally spoke, her voice carrying the same measured authority it had held that morning. "I need to see Carter's personnel file." Frank's smile flickered for just a moment. "Now, Liana, you know personnel matters have their own procedures." "His complete file," she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "On my desk by end of day." The smile vanished entirely for a second before Frank forced it back into place. "Surely we can handle this more informally?" "End of day, Frank." She picked up her pen again, a clear dismissal. Frank stood, adjusting his suit jacket with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. "We're all on the same team here, Liana. Let's not let one unfortunate incident damage long-standing relationships." Judge Brooks had already returned to her work, her pen moving steadily across the legal pad before her. The afternoon docket proceeded without interruption, but the whispers continued. By 5 o'clock, when most of the courthouse staff had begun to filter out, Judge Brooks remained in her chambers. The building grew quiet, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, doors closing in distant corridors. At 6:15, a manila envelope appeared on her desk, delivered by a nervous-looking intern from the administrative office. Judge Brooks opened it immediately, spreading the contents across her desk with methodical precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she began to read. Her expression remained neutral, but her jaw tightened as she worked through the documents. 4 prior complaints, each one carefully documented and then quietly buried. All of them had been resolved informally, with no formal disciplinary action taken. One name caught her attention immediately: Andrea Silva. The complaint was from 3 years ago, a detailed account from a respected public defender with 15 years of experience. Silva had since left the public defender's office, her departure as quiet as the resolution of her complaint. Judge Brooks reached for a fresh legal pad, the yellow paper bright under the office lights. Her pen moved across the page with purpose, each letter precisely formed. Pattern. Must go back at least 5 years. The words stood stark against the yellow paper, a simple phrase that carried the weight of years of accumulated injustice. She set her pen down and looked at the scattered personnel files, each page telling part of a story that was finally coming to light. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with early autumn sunlight casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Judge Liana Brooks arrived precisely at 6:45 a.m., her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor of the entrance hall. Unlike yesterday, she wore her full professional attire, a charcoal gray suit that fit her perfectly, paired with a deep purple blouse that brought out the warmth in her brown skin. The building was quiet at this hour, still holding on to the peaceful emptiness of night. Her footsteps echoed through the corridors as she made her way to her courtroom. The familiar scent of industrial cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee from the security station. Clarence was there, as he had been every morning for the past 20 years. His mop moved in slow, methodical strokes across the floor outside her courtroom. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creasing into its usual expression of quiet dignity. "You made some noise yesterday," he said simply, pausing in his work. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen decades of courthouse drama unfold from the shadows. Liana nodded but said nothing. She didn't need to. Clarence's slight smile told her he understood completely. He had probably witnessed the whole incident from his usual corner, invisible to those who rarely bothered to notice the maintenance staff. In her chambers, Liana settled into her morning routine with practiced efficiency. She arranged her files for the day's cases, checked her calendar, and reviewed her notes from yesterday. But today, there was an additional task weighing on her mind. Opening her computer, she navigated to the court's internal complaint system. The interface was modern enough, updated within the last few years to meet new digital standards. But as she began searching for Carter's older complaints, she hit a wall. The system only showed records from the past 3 years. Frowning, she dug deeper. After 20 minutes of searching, she discovered why. Carter's earlier complaints had been logged under an outdated system, one that newer staff couldn't access without special administrator privileges. It was a common enough practice in government institutions. Old systems were rarely fully integrated with new ones, creating convenient digital dead zones where information could be effectively hidden in plain sight. Liana picked up her phone and dialed the Human Resources Department. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "HR, this is Patricia. Patricia, Judge Brooks here. I need all personnel complaints from the last 10 years related to security and bailiff conduct." There was a pause on the other line. "All complaints, Your Honor?" "Yes, all of them, including those from the old system." Patricia hesitated. "That might take some time to compile, and there are privacy considerations." "You can redact names and sensitive information," Liana interrupted smoothly. "I need to review the pattern of complaints, not individual details." Another pause. I'll see what I can do, Your Honor." "Thank you, Patricia. I'll expect it before lunch." The morning proceeded with its usual parade of cases. Liana maintained her focus on each matter before her, giving every defendant and attorney her full attention. But in the back of her mind, questions continued to circle. How many complaints had been buried? How many incidents had been smoothed over with a quiet word and an informal resolution? At 11:45 a.m., just before the lunch recess, a manila envelope arrived from HR. Liana waited until her courtroom had cleared before opening it in her chambers. Inside, she found a surprisingly thin folder containing just 12 complaints. All were from the past 3 years. She spread the documents across her desk, studying them carefully. Something wasn't right. In a courthouse this size, with dozens of security personnel and bailiffs interacting with hundreds of people daily, 12 complaints over 10 years was implausibly low. She had been a public defender long enough to know that complaints were far more common than this folder suggested. Liana reached for her phone and opened her secure messaging app. She typed a message to Tanya, her tech-savvy clerk who had been with the court for 5 years. Tanya had a gift for finding digital breadcrumbs that others missed. And more importantly, she understood the importance of discretion. "Can you find hidden records? Old server backups, anything buried?" The response came quickly. "On it." Liana set her phone down and looked out her chamber window at the city beyond. The morning sun had given way to clouds, casting shifting shadows across the buildings below. She thought about Andrea Silva's complaint, buried in Carter's personnel file. How many other Andrea Silvas were out there, their voices muffled by a system designed to protect itself? The weight of yesterday's confrontation still hung in the air of the courthouse. She could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she passed, in the careful neutrality of other judges' greetings, in the slightly too wide berth people gave her in the hallways. But now, sitting in her chambers with that suspiciously thin folder of complaints before her, she understood that yesterday's incident was just the visible part of something much deeper. Her computer chimed with an incoming email. The afternoon docket would begin in 15 minutes. Liana gathered the complaints and locked them carefully in her desk drawer. She straightened her robe, checked her reflection in the small mirror on her wall, and took a deep breath. The real work was just beginning. That afternoon, as the courtroom cleared for a brief recess, two of the court's clerks, Michelle Thompson and Kendra Davis, lingered behind. They approached Judge Brooks's bench with a mix of hesitation and determination in their steps. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the nearly empty courtroom, casting harsh shadows across the polished wood surfaces. "Your Honor," Michelle began, her voice soft but steady, "we wanted to thank you for yesterday." She clasped her hands together, a gesture that spoke of contained emotion. Liana looked up from her notes, setting down her pen. The two women before her were both exceptional at their jobs, known for their efficiency and professionalism. She had always sensed a careful restraint in their interactions with court personnel, the kind of measured behavior that came from years of navigating difficult spaces. "What happened yesterday needed to happen," Liana replied simply, her dark eyes meeting theirs. Kendra shifted her weight, glancing briefly at the closed courtroom doors before speaking. "It's just, we've seen it before. With Carter." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "I had my own run-in with him last year." Liana leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. "Tell me." "There was an emergency filing that needed immediate processing," Kendra explained, her voice growing firmer as she spoke. "I was trying to get Carter's attention because he was blocking the entrance to Judge Morton's chambers. When he ignored me, I raised my voice, not shouting, just speaking urgently." She shook her head, the memory clearly still fresh. "He filed a complaint against me for being excessively loud and intimidating." Michelle nodded, adding, "I remember that day. You were just doing your job." "What happened to the complaint?" Liana asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Nothing," Kendra replied, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "It was dismissed. Actually, worse than dismissed. It was like it never existed. When I tried to follow up, they said there was no record of any complaint being filed." The three women shared a moment of silent understanding. It was a familiar story, the kind that played out in courthouses, offices, and institutions across the country, the kind that left no paper trail but plenty of scars. Later that afternoon, Liana sat in Conference Room B for the monthly administrative meeting. The room was filled with the usual faces: 7 judges, various court administrators, and Frank Denlow at the head of the long mahogany table. The agenda covered routine matters, budget allocations, scheduling conflicts, security protocols, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Denlow cleared his throat during a discussion about courthouse security measures. "Which brings us to yesterday's incident." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "While we all understand the importance of maintaining order, we must be mindful of emotional reactions that might compromise our procedural discipline." The words hung in the air like smoke. Liana kept her expression neutral, even as she noted how several pairs of eyes darted toward her and quickly away. Judge Morton, who had occupied his seat on the bench for over 2 decades, leaned back in his chair. His silver hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "We all have bad mornings," he said with an air of paternal wisdom that made Liana's teeth clench. "Let's not turn this into something larger than it needs to be." Several heads nodded around the table. The message was clear. This was their attempt to minimize yesterday's events, to reduce what happened to a simple misunderstanding, rather than a symptom of a deeper problem. Liana smiled politely, her hands folded neatly on the table. She had expected this, of course. The system's first response to any challenge was always to minimize, to smooth things over, to maintain the status quo. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The meeting continued with its usual efficiency, moving through agenda items with practiced ease. But the atmosphere remained charged, like the air before a storm. When Liana returned to her chambers, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through her window. She had just settled at her desk when her computer chimed with an incoming email from Tanya. The subject line read simply, "Found them." Liana's heart quickened as she opened the message. Tanya's email was brief and to the point, but the implications were staggering. She had discovered over 140 incident reports, all marked as closed without action. The reports were spread across 5 different bailiffs, with Carter's name appearing prominently among them. "They buried it all," Liana whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum of her computer. The reports had been systematically hidden, tucked away in archived servers and marked with obsolete filing codes that made them virtually invisible to regular searches. It was the kind of bureaucratic sleight of hand that could only come from years of practiced concealment. Liana sat back in her chair, the weight of this discovery settling over her like a heavy cloak. The afternoon light painted golden stripes across her desk, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. The courthouse was quieting down for the day, but her mind was racing with the implications of what Tanya had uncovered. 140 complaints, 140 incidents that someone had decided weren't worth addressing. 140 times when someone's voice had been silenced, their experience dismissed, their dignity compromised. The revelation sat in her chest like a stone. This wasn't just about Carter, or even about what had happened to her yesterday. This was about a system that had perfected the art of burying inconvenient truths, of maintaining its power through careful erasure and strategic forgetfulness. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Liana's chambers as she sat with Tanya and Jordan Ellis, her third-year law student intern. The three women formed a tight circle around her desk, voices low despite the closed door. Papers and legal pads were scattered across the surface, covered in Jordan's neat handwriting detailing their brainstorming session. "We need something secure," Liana said, tapping her pen against the desk. "Something that can't be traced back to the complainants." She had seen too many careers derailed by speaking up, too many legitimate grievances buried under bureaucratic paperwork. Jordan leaned forward, her dark eyes bright with an idea. "What about an encrypted Google form? We could set it up with anonymous submissions, maybe route it through a secure server." The young law student's enthusiasm was palpable, her natural problem-solving instincts kicking in. Tanya, who had been quietly typing on her laptop, looked up with a slight smile. "I have something better in mind." Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she spoke. "We can create a secure reporting link, completely anonymous, hosted off the courthouse network entirely." She turned her laptop around, showing them a clean, simple interface she had already started building. "How secure are we talking?" Liana asked, studying the screen. "Military-grade encryption," Tanya replied. "No IP tracking, no cookies, no digital footprints. Even if someone tried to trace it, they'd hit nothing but dead ends." Her usual quiet demeanor was replaced by confident expertise. "I can have it ready within a few hours." Jordan whistled softly. "That's impressive, but how do we get people to trust it enough to actually use it?" Liana sat back in her chair, considering. "We make it clear that their safety is our priority. We keep it simple, professional, and focused on facts." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And we make sure they know this isn't about revenge, it's about truth." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Tanya worked on coding and security measures, while Jordan helped draft the introduction text for the form. Liana reviewed every detail, ensuring the questions were clear but not leading, comprehensive but not overwhelming. By 11:45 a.m., Tanya looked up from her laptop. "It's ready." She turned the screen to show the finished product. The interface was clean and professional, with clear instructions and carefully worded questions. Most importantly, it was secure. Liana nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. She opened her email and began composing a new message. The recipient field remained empty as she typed each address into the BCC line. Every employee, intern, clerk, and judge in the courthouse. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as she considered the subject line. Finally, she typed, "Silence ends here. Your voice is protected." The message itself was brief but powerful, explaining the purpose of the reporting system and providing the secure link. She read it over one final time, then pressed send. The email disappeared into cyberspace, reaching hundreds of inboxes simultaneously. "And now we wait," Jordan said softly. Liana stood, smoothing her robes. "No, now we work. We proceed as normal." She gathered her files for the afternoon docket. "The best way to protect this process is to maintain absolute normalcy." The afternoon proceeded like any other day in Courtroom 4B. Liana presided over 3 motion hearings, 2 sentencing procedures, and a lengthy custody dispute. Her voice remained steady, her decisions clear and well-reasoned. Nothing in her demeanor suggested that anything unusual was happening behind the scenes. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind occasionally drifted to the reporting link. How many people would be brave enough to come forward? How many stories had been buried over the years, waiting for a chance to be told? The sun had long since set when Liana finally returned to her chambers. The courthouse had grown quiet, with only the occasional echo of footsteps in the distant hallways. She closed her door, sat at her desk, and logged into the secure dashboard Tanya had created. The number stopped her breath. 67 entries in just 6 hours. Her hands trembled slightly as she began reading. The stories poured out, each one a testament to years of silent suffering. Bailiffs muttering racial slurs under their breath when they thought no one could hear. Attorneys of color facing inexplicable delays in getting their motions heard. Black jurors being subjected to extra searches while their white counterparts walked through security unchallenged. 2 reports mentioned Carter specifically, describing incidents that matched the pattern she had already begun to uncover. But these were more detailed, more personal. One described how he had blocked a young black attorney from entering the courthouse, claiming her bar card looked fake. Another detailed how he had followed a Latina clerk through 3 floors of the courthouse, claiming she looked suspicious. "It's worse than I thought," Liana whispered to herself, the words barely audible in the quiet room. The screen's blue light illuminated her face as she continued reading, each entry adding another piece to a picture that grew darker by the minute. The reports weren't just about individual acts of prejudice, they revealed a systemic pattern, a culture of intimidation and discrimination that had become so normalized that many had simply accepted it as part of their daily reality. But now, given a safe way to speak up, they were finally telling their stories. Each entry represented someone who had chosen to break their silence, to trust that maybe this time, something would be different. This time, someone was listening. This time, the truth wouldn't be buried in a forgotten server or marked closed without action. Liana sat back in her chair, the weight of these testimonies settling over her. 67 voices in just 6 hours. 67 stories that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, and it was exactly as devastating as she had feared. The morning light was just beginning to warm the courthouse walls when a soft knock echoed through Liana's chambers. She looked up from her stack of case files to see Clarence, the courthouse janitor, standing in her doorway. His weathered face held an expression she'd never seen before, a mixture of determination and something that looked almost like hope. "I saw your email," he said quietly, stepping into the room. His work uniform was neat but faded from countless washes, and in his hands, he held what looked like an old manila folder, its edges soft and worn from years of handling. It was tied with a simple piece of twine, the kind used to bind old documents in archive rooms. Liana gestured for him to come in, noting how carefully he closed the door behind him. In all her time at the courthouse, she'd never seen Clarence initiate a conversation with anyone. He was always there, always working, but somehow managing to blend into the background like a shadow. "Please sit," she said, indicating the chair across from her desk. Clarence shook his head. "Won't take but a minute, Judge Brooks." He stepped forward and placed the folder on her desk with the gentle reverence of someone handling something precious. "Been keeping these for a long time. Thought maybe now was the right time for someone to see them." The folder looked like it had seen decades of use. The manila material was discolored with age, and the corners were soft and rounded from countless handlings. The twine that held it together was knotted with careful precision. As Liana began to untie the twine, Clarence stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him. Inside the folder, she found page after page of careful handwriting, neat, methodical notes written in a steady hand. They were dated, organized chronologically, each entry precise and detailed. These weren't random observations, they were logs, systematic records spanning more than 3 decades. Clarence had documented everything he'd witnessed in his years of service at the courthouse. Each page told stories of subtle discrimination and systemic bias that most people would have missed or ignored. There were entries about promising young black clerks who were passed over for promotions despite stellar performance reviews. Notes about Hispanic attorneys who were suddenly reassigned after raising concerns about courtroom practices. Detailed accounts of staff members who simply disappeared from the courthouse roster without explanation. "I've been here 32 years, Clarence said softly, breaking the silence as Liana read. "Started when I was 23. Back then, there weren't many folks who looked like us in these halls. Not much has changed really, just got more subtle about it." His voice carried the weight of years of silent observation. As a janitor, he had been invisible to most of the courthouse staff, present but unseen, hearing everything but never acknowledged. He had used that invisibility to become a witness to history. Some folks, they'd get promoted quick, right connections, right look, right background, he continued. Others, good people, hard workers. They'd hit what they called the experience ceiling. Always needed just a little more seasoning before they could move up. Funny how that seasoning never seemed to come. Liana continued turning pages, each entry more detailed than the last. Clarence had recorded dates, times, locations, and names. He'd noted patterns in hiring practices, documented casual comments made in break rooms, and tracked the subtle ways certain staff members were excluded from important meetings or social gatherings. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Liana asked, looking up from the pages. Clarence's expression didn't change, but his eyes held years of hard-earned wisdom. Who would have listened? And what good would it have done? Sometimes surviving means keeping your head down, Judge Brooks. But when I saw your email yesterday, well, maybe times are changing. As she reached the bottom of the stack, a particular entry caught her eye. The name jumped off the page, Frank Denlow. The entry was dated 1998, and it detailed a formal racial bias complaint filed against him by a junior staff member. According to Clarence's notes, the complainant had provided substantial evidence of discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion decisions. Liana's breath caught as she read further. The complaint had been properly filed, following all procedural requirements. There should have been an official record, an investigation, a formal response. But according to Clarence's notes, the file had simply vanished. The complainant was transferred to another district shortly after, and the matter was never mentioned again. She looked up at Clarence, the weight of this revelation settling over her. "This started long before me," she said quietly, the words heavy with understanding. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across her chamber floor. Through her window, she could hear the courthouse beginning to stir to life, doors opening, voices in the hallways, the steady rhythm of another day beginning. But in her office, time seemed to stand still as she absorbed the significance of what Clarence had shared. 32 years of silent witness, documented with the careful precision of someone who understood the power of truth. 3 decades of systematic discrimination, preserved in neat handwriting on aging pages. And at the bottom of it all, a name she knew well, connected to a pattern that stretched back far longer than she had imagined. Frank Denlow wasn't just part of the current problem. He was one of its architects, a key player in a system designed to maintain what he called courtroom culture. The missing complaint from 1998 wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a carefully constructed pattern of institutional gatekeeping. Clarence stood quietly, his presence as unobtrusive as ever. But there was a subtle shift in his bearing. For the first time in 32 years, he had chosen to step out of the shadows, to add his voice to those speaking up. His years of careful documentation had created an irrefutable record of the very patterns Liana was now working to expose. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in Liana's chambers, casting striped shadows across her desk. Her coffee had grown lukewarm, forgotten as she pored over Clarence's meticulously documented records for the 3rd time since arriving at work. The manila folder lay open before her, its pages spread out like fallen autumn leaves, each one telling its own story of injustice. Her eyes kept returning to one particular entry, dated 2 years ago. The handwriting was as precise as all the others, but something about this incident made her pause each time she read it. Andrea Silva, public defender, Filed complaint against Carter bailiff. Reference number 2021-447. Beneath the entry, Clarence had noted in his careful script, "Complaint disappeared from system within 48 hours. Ms. Silva transferred to District 7 2 weeks later." Liana picked up her coffee cup, grimacing slightly at the tepid temperature as she took a sip. She had known Andrea Silva by reputation, a brilliant public defender with a track record of successful cases and a dedication to her clients that went above and beyond. Her sudden transfer had raised eyebrows at the time, but like so many other things, it had been explained away as a career opportunity. Now, looking at Clarence's notes and connecting them with Carter's personnel file, a clearer picture was emerging. Liana reached for her phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing the number for District 7's Public Defender's Office. After 2 transfers and a brief hold, a cautious voice answered, "Andrea Silva speaking." "Ms. Silva, this is Judge Liana Brooks from District 6. Liana kept her voice warm but professional. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything urgent." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Liana to hear papers shuffling and a door closing. When Andrea spoke again, her voice was guarded. "No interruption, Your Honor. How can I help you?" "I'm conducting an internal review of certain courthouse practices," Liana began, choosing her words carefully. "Your name came up in connection with an incident involving Bailiff Carter 2 years ago." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Liana could almost feel Andrea's hesitation through the phone line. "That was a difficult time," Andrea finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. I assumed it wasn't considered serious enough to warrant attention. I'd like to hear about it if you're willing to share," Liana said gently. "Off the record for now." Another pause, shorter this time. Then Andrea's words began to flow, as if a dam had broken. It started with small things, comments about my appearance, my accent. Carter would say things like, "Your skirt is too spicy for court," or make jokes about whether I was legal. I tried to ignore it at first. Liana's hand tightened around her pen as she took notes, her writing nearly as precise as Clarence's. "What changed?" "It got worse during trials," Andrea continued, her voice stronger now. "I was representing a young Hispanic man in a drug possession case. Every time I stood to object, Carter would move closer to me, stand right behind my chair. One day I objected to improper character evidence and he told the judge I was being hostile and erratic, said I was a security concern." Liana remembered the case. It had been before Judge Morton. She hadn't been in the courtroom that day, but she recalled hearing about some kind of disruption. "The judge believed him?" Liana asked, though she already knew the answer. "Of course," Andrea replied, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "Carter was just doing his job. I filed a formal complaint the next day, followed every procedure, documented everything. Then," she trailed off. "Nothing happened," Liana finished for her. "Worse than nothing," Andrea corrected. 2 weeks later, my supervisor suggested I consider a transfer to District 7, said it would be better for my career trajectory. The message was pretty clear. Liana glanced at the dashboard on her computer screen, where the anonymous reporting link continued to collect new entries. The count had risen to 112, with new complaints appearing roughly every 4 minutes. A pattern was emerging, and Andrea's story was fitting right into it. "Ms. Silva," Liana said, straightening in her chair, "would you be willing to come in and provide a sealed affidavit about your experience?" The pause this time was shorter, more determined. "You're really looking into this? Actually investigating?" "Yes," Liana replied simply, "and your testimony could be crucial." "Then yes," Andrea said firmly. "I'll do it. Not just for me, but for everyone else who's been through something similar. When do you need me?" As Liana arranged the details with Andrea, her computer pinged with another notification. Another complaint had come in through the anonymous system. This one mentioned Officer Raymond, the third complaint about him in the past hour. The pattern was growing clearer by the minute. She ended the call with Andrea, having scheduled the affidavit for the following morning. Looking at her computer screen, she watched as another complaint appeared, then another. The dashboard now showed 112 total entries, with new ones appearing steadily. Officer Raymond's name stood out repeatedly in the recent submissions, each one describing incidents similar to what Andrea had experienced. The morning sun had climbed higher now, erasing the striped shadows from her desk. Liana took another sip of her now cold coffee, her eyes moving between Clarence's folder and the growing list of complaints on her screen. 2 years ago, Andrea Silva had stood alone against this system and been silenced. Now, her voice would join a chorus of others, each one adding strength to the truth that could no longer be buried. The afternoon light streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows in the marble hallway. Liana walked briskly between hearings, her black robe flowing behind her as she carried a stack of files. The corridor was mostly empty, save for a few clerks hurrying past with their heads down. She heard the footsteps before she saw him, the distinct sound of expensive leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. Frank Denlow appeared from around the corner, his silver hair perfectly combed, and his suit immaculate as always. His face wore what seemed to be a friendly smile, but his eyes were hard as steel. He positioned himself directly in her path, forcing her to stop. Other court staff who had been in the hallway suddenly found reasons to disappear, leaving them alone. "Judge Brooks," he said, his voice low and smooth as honey but laced with something darker. "Got a minute?" Liana kept her expression neutral, though she noticed how he had deliberately placed himself between her and the courtroom where her next hearing was scheduled. "I have a hearing in 10 minutes, Frank." He stepped closer, just enough to make it uncomfortable. "You've stirred up quite a storm, Judge Brooks." His voice dropped even lower, taking on a threatening casualness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "What are you trying to do, burn the place down?" Liana didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, her stack of files held like a shield between them. The air felt thick with tension, but she refused to be intimidated by his attempt at power play. "I'm doing my job," she replied evenly. Denlow's false smile widened slightly. "Let's talk about solutions here. I think we can find a way to handle this that works for everyone." He gestured toward an empty conference room nearby. "Shall we?" Liana didn't move. "Say what you need to say, Frank." He sighed as if disappointed by her lack of cooperation. "Look, here's what we can do. We quietly reinstate the officers. No harm, no foul. We'll call this whole investigation a procedural training review." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "Everyone saves face, and we can implement some sensitivity training or whatever makes you happy." The sunlight through the windows had shifted, throwing half of his face into shadow. Liana could see the calculation in his eyes, the absolute certainty that she would take his offer. "If you keep digging," he continued, his voice taking on an edge of warning, "you'll embarrass this whole court system. Is that what you want? To drag everyone's reputation through the mud?" He shook his head slowly. "You're not here to clean house, Judge Brooks. You're here to maintain balance." The words hung in the air between them. Liana thought of Clarence's carefully documented records, of Andrea Silva's voice trembling with suppressed anger, of the steady stream of complaints flowing into the anonymous reporting system. She thought of all the voices that had been silenced, all the careers derailed, all the justice denied. She looked directly into Denlow's eyes, her voice clear and steady in the empty hallway. "I'm here to judge," she said. "That includes you." The friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. But before he could respond, Liana stepped around him and continued toward her courtroom, her robes sweeping behind her like a declaration of war. She could feel his eyes boring into her back as she walked away, but she didn't turn around. Her steps were measured and confident, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. The rest of the day passed in a blur of hearings and motions, but Liana maintained her usual composure. She ruled on cases, heard arguments, and managed her courtroom with the same careful attention to detail she always showed. If her clerks noticed that she was more quiet than usual during breaks, they didn't mention it. The sun had long since set when Liana finally returned to her chambers. The courthouse was quiet now, with only the occasional sound of the cleaning crew in the distance. She sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen the only light in the room, and began reviewing the day's notes. Her phone buzzed with a message from Tanya. Liana picked it up, her eyes widening slightly as she read, "Found admin emails with flagged language, might be coded discrimination. Want to see them?" Liana's fingers moved across the keyboard without hesitation. "Send everything." She sat back in her chair, waiting for Tanya's response, thinking about Denlo's threat disguised as a compromise. The building was silent around her, but she could feel the weight of decades of buried injustice pressing in from all sides. Whatever was in those emails, she knew it would only confirm what she already suspected, that the rot went deeper than anyone had admitted. Her phone screen lit up again with Tanya's incoming data, and Liana leaned forward, ready to face whatever truth was about to be revealed. The blue light from Tanya's computer screen cast a ghostly glow across her face as she pulled up the email archives. Liana stood behind her chair, while Jordan perched on the edge of a nearby desk, all three women huddled together in the dim chamber lit only by desk lamps. The air felt charged with purpose, heavy with the weight of what they might discover. "Here's what I found," Tanya said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. "I created a database of all internal communications between senior staff over the past 5 years. Then I cross-referenced dates, names, and certain repeated phrases that seemed suspicious to me." She pulled up a spreadsheet that sprawled across the screen, filled with highlighted text and timestamps. "Look at these patterns. They're too consistent to be coincidence." Liana leaned closer, her eyes scanning the rows of data, the light reflecting off her determined face. The first email that caught her attention was from Denlo to Judge Morton. "Need to maintain appropriate courtroom tone. Some of our newer additions seem excitable." "Seems innocent enough," Jordan commented, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But look at the date." Tanya nodded, her expression grim. This was sent the day after Maria Gonzalez, that new public defender, won her first major case. Remember how passionate her closing argument was? The jury couldn't look away. "I remember," Liana said quietly, a muscle working in her jaw. "She was brilliant, compassionate but fierce, but she left 6 months later, said something about not being a good fit." Tanya scrolled through more emails, her mouth set in a tight line. "Keep the culture intact" appeared in multiple messages, always following discussions about diversity initiatives or new hires. "Watch for volatile types" showed up repeatedly in hiring committee correspondence. "Here's where it gets interesting," Tanya said, pulling up another screen with a few quick keystrokes. "I created a timeline matching these emails with personnel changes and major court events. The correlation is, well, see for yourself." The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in dark room fluid. Every time the phrase "volatile types" appeared, it was within days of a new black or brown intern starting their position. Maintaining tone correlations were even more striking. The phrase appeared exclusively in discussions about female attorneys, particularly women of color, who had shown assertiveness in court. Jordan pulled out her legal pad and started taking notes, her pen moving furiously across the paper. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to the screen with the tip of her pen. "Courtroom balance must be preserved." That was right after the Thompson case. Liana remembered that case well. A white officer had been acquitted by an all-white jury in a controversial shooting. The email thread that followed was filled with seemingly innocuous phrases about traditional standards and maintaining order. "Pull up the hiring data from those periods," Liana instructed, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Tanya typed rapidly, bringing up another spreadsheet. The numbers told their own story. After each instance of these coded phrases, there was a pattern of denied promotions, transferred staff, or voluntary departures, predominantly affecting people of color and outspoken women. "They were smart about it," Tanya said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Nothing explicitly discriminatory, nothing that would trigger automatic flags in HR. Just these careful, professional-sounding phrases that gave them plausible deniability." "But look at the impact," Jordan added, flipping through her notes, her eyes wide with indignation. "Every time they talked about maintaining culture, someone got pushed out. Every time they mentioned tone, a strong woman attorney got passed over for promotion. It's like watching dominoes fall." Liana straightened up, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about Carter or a few racist bailiffs. This was systematic, carefully orchestrated discrimination hidden behind professional language and bureaucratic procedures. "Show me the frequency analysis," she requested, her hands gripping the back of Tanya's chair. Tanya pulled up a graph showing how often these phrases appeared over time. The pattern was clear. They increased whenever diversity in the courthouse began to rise, whenever voices of change grew too loud. The spikes in the data told a story of deliberate suppression. "Cross-reference this with Clarence's records," Liana said, her voice soft but commanding. Jordan pulled out the old janitor's folder, and they began matching dates and incidents. The correlation was undeniable. What Clarence had observed from the shadows, these emails confirmed through official channels. His handwritten notes lined up perfectly with the digital trail. "Look at this thread," Tanya said, highlighting a series of messages, her dark eyes flashing with intensity. "Right after Andrea Silva filed her complaint against Carter. Denlow wrote to HR about maintaining professional standards and avoiding disruption. 2 weeks later, her complaint disappeared from the system. Just vanished, like it never happened." The three women worked late into the night, piecing together the evidence. Each email they uncovered added another thread to the tapestry of systematic discrimination. What appeared on the surface as routine administrative communication revealed itself as a carefully constructed framework for maintaining the status quo. Finally, Liana stepped back from the computer, her expression grave but determined. She gathered them close, aware of the weight of what they'd uncovered. "We're not just looking at racism," she said, her voice low but intense. "We're looking at strategy, a system of it, one that's been working for years because it's invisible to those who aren't looking for it." Jordan looked up from her legal pad, her eyes bright with purpose. "So, what's next? Where do we go from here?" Liana reached for the folder containing their findings and closed it with a decisive snap. Exposure. The word hung in the air between them, a promise and a challenge all at once. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Liana's chambers, casting thin stripes of light across her desk. It was Friday, and the courthouse hummed with its usual end-of-week energy. As she entered her office, her eyes immediately fell on a cream-colored envelope placed precisely in the center of her desk blotter. The official letterhead of the Judicial Review Panel gleamed with embossed gold lettering. Her heart didn't race, but a familiar stillness settled over her, the same calm focus she'd developed over years of handling critical cases. With deliberate movements, she set down her briefcase and hung her robe on its hook before taking her seat. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, weighted with more than just paper. As she broke the seal and unfolded the letter, the carefully crafted language jumped out at her immediately. Breach of conduct. Hostile administration. Unauthorized data collection. Each phrase was a polished stone, smooth on the surface but meant to bruise when thrown. The language was precise, clinical even. It outlined her alleged infractions with the kind of careful wording that would sound perfectly reasonable to an outsider. But Liana had spent decades reading between lines, seeing the threats hidden in neutral phrases. This wasn't just a review. It was a warning shot. She read it again, more slowly this time, her legal mind dissecting each paragraph. The accusations were masterfully vague, impossible to directly refute without more specific charges. They had constructed a perfect trap. Defending herself would require her to reveal exactly what data she had collected and how she had obtained it. Tanya arrived first that morning as usual. When she saw Liana's expression, she quietly closed the chamber door behind her. Jordan arrived minutes later, and Liana wordlessly handed them both the letter. "They're trying to bury us," Jordan said, her voice tight with anger as she finished reading. She was already pulling out her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let me look up these panel members." Tanya read more slowly, her IT specialist's mind clearly cataloging every implication. "They're specifically targeting the data collection. They know what we found." Jordan's research didn't take long. Judge William Morton, He's played golf with Denlow every Sunday for 15 years. Judge Patricia Hayes, her husband's law firm, handles all of Denlow's personal legal work. And Judge Richard Thompson, he was Denlow's mentor when they both worked in the DA's office. 3 out of 5, Tanya noted quietly. A controlling majority. Liana sat back in her chair, her expression unchanged. She had expected this, or something like it. The system didn't maintain itself without fighting back when threatened. They're not just coming after you, Jordan continued, still scrolling through records. This kind of review could impact anyone who helped collect evidence. They could go after court staff, witnesses. They're trying to scare people into silence, Tanya added, her usual calm demeanor showing cracks of worry. The morning light had shifted, the stripes on Liana's desk now falling at a different angle. She gathered the letter and its envelope, placing them carefully in her briefcase. "I'll handle this at home," she said, her voice steady. "Both of you, go about your normal work today. Don't discuss this with anyone." That evening, in her apartment, Liana moved with the same measured purpose that had carried her through the day. She didn't pace or fret. Instead, she filled her electric kettle and selected a bag of chamomile tea from her collection. While the water heated, she opened her laptop and pulled up the courthouse scheduling system. The whistle of the kettle provided a brief soundtrack as she navigated through the administrative protocols. With careful precision, she scheduled an internal panel hearing for Monday morning. She added a note requesting observers, a perfectly legal and often overlooked procedure that would ensure the review couldn't happen behind closed doors. Steam rose from her tea as she composed a series of text messages. To Andrea Silva, Monday morning, internal review hearing. Your testimony matters now more than ever. To Clarence, your records will finally be heard. Monday, 9 a.m. To the 3 attorneys who had submitted affidavits about their experiences, time to bring this into the light. Monday morning, courthouse panel hearing. The responses came quickly. I'll be there, from Andrea. Count on me, from Clarence. The attorneys replied with brief confirmations, their professional caution evident even in text messages. Liana set her phone down beside her tea and looked out her window at the city lights. The letter lay open on her coffee table, its threats now seeming smaller in her quiet apartment. They had tried to make this personal, to isolate her. Instead, they had given her exactly what she needed, a formal forum where everything could be brought into the light. She took a slow sip of her chamomile tea, its warmth spreading through her chest. The timing was perfect. Monday morning, when the courthouse would be bustling with its heaviest calendar. There would be no hiding this, no quiet burial of inconvenient truths. One by one, she reviewed the names of those who had agreed to testify. Each person represented a thread in the tapestry of discrimination they had uncovered. Each voice would add weight to the evidence Tanya had found, reinforcing the patterns that Clarence had documented over decades. The letter had been meant to silence her. Instead, it had provided the very platform she needed. They had tried to put her on trial, not realizing they had given her a stage. The Monday morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Liana Brooks approached the building. Her black judicial robe, freshly pressed and immaculate, moved with graceful authority as she walked. The sharp click of her heels against marble echoed through the entrance hall, each step precise and measured. She had chosen her most professional attire, a crisp white blouse beneath her robe, pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, and perfectly polished black heels that added to her already commanding presence. The usual morning bustle of the courthouse seemed to pause as she passed. Attorneys clutching coffee cups and legal briefs paused mid-conversation. Court clerks carrying stacks of files slowed their hurried pace. Everyone knew what day it was, what was about to happen. The whispers that had filled the halls last week had grown into an expectant silence. As she rounded the corner toward the conference wing, she passed Clarence. The elderly janitor was methodically polishing the brass railings, just as he had done for 3 decades. But today, when he looked up and nodded at her, his eyes held something different. A quiet pride, a subtle acknowledgement of what they both knew was coming. His small gesture carried the weight of all those years of silent observation, all those carefully documented incidents that would finally see the light of day. Liana returned his nod with the slightest smile, her composure unwavering. Her briefcase felt heavy with the weight of the dossier inside. Hundreds of pages of evidence, testimonies, and records that told a story decades in the making. She had spent the entire weekend organizing it all, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly indexed and cross-referenced. The conference room door loomed ahead, its heavy wood paneling suggesting the gravity of what waited behind it. Liana paused for just a moment, adjusting her robe and squaring her shoulders. Then, with the same deliberate confidence that had carried her through countless trials, she opened the door. The room was arranged like a small courtroom, with a long table at the front where the 5 panelists sat. 3 white men occupied the center positions: Judge William Morton, Judge Richard Thompson, and Judge Michael Harris. Their faces were set in identical masks of stern neutrality, but their stiff postures betrayed their discomfort. To their left sat Judge Diana Washington, the panel's only black member, her dark eyes sharp and attentive. On the right was Judge Amit Patel, his expression carefully professional but not unfriendly. Both offered small nods as Liana entered, subtle gestures of acknowledgement that didn't go unnoticed by the others. In the corner of the room, Frank Denlow had positioned himself strategically, not at the main table, but close enough to observe everything. He sat with affected casualness, one leg crossed over the other, his expression arranged in a mask of mild interest. But Liana noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the armrest of his chair just a little too tightly. The room was larger than she expected, with rows of chairs set up behind the presentation area. Already, several people had quietly taken their seats: court staff, attorneys, and others who had heard about the hearing through official channels or courthouse whispers. Among them, she spotted Andrea Silva, sitting straight-backed in the second row, her expression determined. Clarence had slipped in as well, taking a seat near the back, his worn notebook clutched in his hands. Liana moved to the podium with measured steps, setting her briefcase on the small table beside it. The sound of her heels on the carpeted floor seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed room. She could feel Denlow's eyes on her, watching for any sign of nervousness or uncertainty. She gave him none. Judge Morton cleared his throat, preparing to begin the proceedings with what would undoubtedly be a carefully worded opening statement about procedural propriety and professional conduct. But Liana was already moving, her actions smooth and practiced. She opened her briefcase and withdrew the thick dossier she had prepared. The sound of its weight hitting the podium seemed to reverberate through the silent room. Before Morton could speak, she looked directly at the panel, her voice clear and unwavering. "I've prepared my response," she stated, her tone carrying the same authority she used in her own courtroom. "It includes witness testimony, whistleblower logs, and systemic misconduct records, all of which you've ignored until now." She stepped forward, the dossier held firmly in both hands. With deliberate movements, she walked to the panel's table and placed the document directly in front of them. The thud of its landing seemed to echo the weight of its contents. Silence fell over the room. Complete, absolute silence. Judge Morton's mouth remained slightly open, his prepared statement forgotten. Judge Thompson's face had lost some of its color. Judge Harris stared at the dossier as if it might bite him. Judge Washington and Judge Patel exchanged a quick glance, their expressions unreadable. In his corner, Denlow had uncrossed his legs and was sitting perfectly still, his affected casualness completely gone. The dossier lay there on the table, its presence as loud as any testimony. On its cover, in clear professional lettering, was a simple title: Systematic Discrimination and Misconduct in the Superior Court System, a Documented History. The panel members began leafing through the dossier, their reactions varying from carefully controlled to openly disturbed. Judge Morton's fingers trembled slightly as he turned each page. Judge Washington adjusted her reading glasses, leaning in to study the documents more closely, her forehead creasing with each new revelation. Liana moved back to the podium, her posture relaxed but professional. She didn't need notes for what came next. She had lived this story, had spent weeks piecing it together, and now knew every detail by heart. The weight of truth gave her words a quiet power that filled the room. "Last week," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, Bailiff Carter attempted to forcibly remove me from my own courtroom, refusing to acknowledge my identity as a judge despite being shown proper credentials. She paused, letting that sink in. This incident, while disturbing, was not isolated. It was merely the latest in a pattern spanning decades. She gestured to the documents before them. The evidence shows systematic discrimination targeting people of color, particularly women, within our courthouse. When I investigated Carter's personnel file, I found 4 prior complaints, all mysteriously resolved informally. This led to a deeper investigation. Her steady gaze swept across the panel members, making brief but meaningful eye contact with each one. Liana walked them through the timeline methodically, her words measured and precise. She detailed how the discovery of Carter's buried complaints had led to Tanya's digital investigation, revealing over 140 redacted incident reports marked as closed without action. She explained the anonymous reporting system they had created and how quickly complaints had poured in, a flood of testimonies that had been silenced for too long. But most telling, she continued, were the internal emails. She directed the panel to specific pages in the dossier. You'll find extensive correspondence using coded language to mask discriminatory intent. Phrases like maintain courtroom tone and watch for volatile types consistently appear in discussions about minority staff and attorneys. Her voice remained even, letting the evidence speak for itself. The room remained silent except for the soft rustle of papers as the panel followed along. In his corner, Denlow had grown very still, his earlier affected casualness completely gone. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his upper lip. Liana turned slightly. "I'd like to call my first witness. Andrea Silva, please step forward." Andrea rose from her seat, smoothing her navy suit as she walked to the witness chair. Her hands shook slightly as she held her affidavit, but her voice grew stronger with each word she read, drawing strength from finally being heard. 2 years ago, I served as a public defender in this courthouse, Andrea began. Bailiff Carter repeatedly made inappropriate comments about my appearance, suggesting my clothing was too spicy for court. When I objected to his behavior during trial, he told the judge I was hostile and erratic. She continued, describing how her formal complaint had vanished into the system, how the hostile environment had eventually forced her to seek employment elsewhere. The pain of that injustice still reflected in her eyes, but alongside it burned a fierce determination. As Andrea spoke, several people in the audience nodded in recognition. Judge Washington removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose as she listened, her expression a mixture of weariness and growing resolve. Next, Clarence made his way to the front. The elderly janitor carried his worn notebook with careful dignity. His voice was quiet but clear as he described 30 years of systematic discrimination he had witnessed and documented. The room fell even more silent, everyone leaning forward to catch his soft-spoken testimony. "I kept track because somebody had to," he explained, his weathered hands gently turning the pages of his notebook. "I saw good people pushed out, saw how certain judges treated certain lawyers different, saw how some folks got promoted while others got moved around until they left." He detailed specific incidents, dates, names, all carefully recorded in his precise handwriting. His simple, straightforward account carried the weight of decades of silent witness. Tanya stepped forward last, wheeling in a large screen. Her presentation was clinical, professional, and devastating. Graphs and charts appeared showing clear patterns of discrimination. Heat maps illustrated how certain judges and bailiffs consistently targeted minorities. Timeline analyses revealed spikes in incidents following diversity initiatives. Her technical expertise transformed countless individual stories into an undeniable pattern of systemic abuse. "The data shows undeniable patterns," Tanya explained, her voice steady as she clicked through slides. "We found that attorneys of color were 3 times more likely to be subjected to additional security screening. Female attorneys of color were 5 times more likely to have their courtroom objections characterized as aggressive or hostile in official records." Her quiet competence lent additional weight to the damning statistics displayed behind her. The room had grown increasingly tense as each piece of evidence built upon the last. Judge Harris had loosened his collar. Judge Thompson was taking rapid notes. Judge Washington and Judge Patel exchanged significant looks, a silent communication passing between them. In the heavy silence that followed Tanya's presentation, Judge Patel leaned forward. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly. "Were these complaints ever shared with administration prior to your review?" Liana met his gaze steadily. "Yes. They were erased or ignored." The simplicity of her answer highlighted the magnitude of the betrayal. Judge Washington's chair creaked as she leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "And who authorized the purge?" Without hesitation or emotion, Liana turned slightly to face the corner where Denlow sat. Frank Denlow. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Denlow's face had gone pale, but he remained perfectly still, his expression frozen in place, a man watching his carefully constructed world begin to crumble around him. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife when Frank Denlow finally stirred from his corner. His normally confident posture had crumbled, replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable stance as he rose to address the panel. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the room's cool temperature, and his perfectly pressed suit suddenly seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame. "I believe," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "that we should take a brief recess to process this considerable amount of information." His eyes darted between the panel members, searching for allies. His fingers tapped nervously against his thigh, a habit he usually controlled in public settings. Judge Monroe nodded slowly, consulting with his fellow panelists through quick glances and subtle nods. "We'll take 30 minutes, he announced, his tone carefully neutral. "Everyone please return promptly." The way he avoided looking directly at Denlow spoke volumes. As people began filing out of the conference room, Liana gathered her materials with deliberate calm. She could feel Denlow's eyes boring into her back, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of turning around. Instead, she led her team, Tanya, Jordan, and their witnesses, into a quiet alcove down the hall, her steps measured and purposeful. The courthouse's morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Andrea Silva paced nervously, her heels clicking against the stone, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if for protection. Clarence stood quietly against the wall, his weathered hand still holding his precious notebook, thumbs gently caressing its worn edges. Jordan kept glancing back toward the conference room, as if expecting someone to follow them, her young face tight with anxiety and excitement. Tanya moved closer to Liana, her voice barely above a whisper. "You want to play it now?" Her dark eyes held a mixture of anticipation and concern. They had discussed this moment at length, whether to hold back their strongest piece of evidence or lead with it. Timing was everything in these proceedings, and they both knew it. Liana considered for a moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. They had built their case methodically, laying a foundation of evidence that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Now was the time to deliver the final blow, when Denlow was already off balance. During the break, Liana watched as other courthouse staff walked past their group, some offering subtle nods of support, others averting their eyes as if afraid to be associated with them. The whispers had already started spreading through the building about what was happening in that conference room. Change was in the air, and everyone could feel it, like the charged atmosphere before a storm breaks. When they reconvened, the panel members seemed more alert, their earlier shock having hardened into focused attention. Denlow had chosen a different seat, further from the center of the room but still maintaining his air of attempted authority. His collar seemed tighter now, and he kept adjusting it with one finger. Liana stood once more before the panel, her posture straight but relaxed. "Before we conclude," she said, her voice clear and steady, "there is one final piece of evidence I'd like to present." She nodded to Tanya, who stepped forward with a laptop and small speaker, setting them up with quiet efficiency. "This is a voicemail recording," Liana explained, "recovered from Bailiff Carter's old phone through an auto backup system. The timestamp places it immediately after the incident in my courtroom." She paused, making eye contact with each panel member, letting the moment build. "I believe it speaks for itself." Tanya pressed play. The room filled with the slightly tinny but unmistakable voice of Frank Denlow. "You did good. Don't worry, that woman's a fluke. We'll fix this. Just stick to protocol. Culture must be preserved." The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Washington's hand flew to her mouth, eyes widening in shock. Judge Thompson's pen clattered to the table, breaking the stunned silence. Judge Monroe's face darkened with each word, his jaw clenching visibly. But most telling was Denlow himself. What little color remained in his face drained away completely, leaving him ashen and suddenly looking much older. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Judge Patel leaned forward, his expression grave, hands clasped tightly together. "Could we hear that again, please?" Tanya obliged, and once more Denlow's damning words filled the room. This time, everyone seemed to lean in slightly, catching every nuance, every revealing pause and emphasis. The casual dismissal in "that woman," the telling phrase "culture must be preserved," the implicit admission in "we'll fix this." No one moved, barely breathing as the evidence played out. When the recording ended for the second time, Judge Monroe cleared his throat. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. "I believe the panel needs to conduct an immediate internal review." He looked directly at Denlow, his gaze unflinching. "Mr. Denlow, please remain seated." The rest of them were dismissed with a wave of his hand. Liana gathered her materials with the same deliberate calm she had maintained throughout the hearing. She nodded respectfully to the panel, then turned and walked out of the conference room, her team following close behind, their footsteps echoing in the hushed space. The morning sun hit her face as she stepped outside the courthouse's heavy doors. For the first time since this all began, since that morning with Carter in her courtroom, Liana allowed herself to smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph or vindication, it was simpler than that. It was the smile of someone who had finally spoken truth to power and been heard. The warm sunlight felt good on her face as she stood there, breathing in the fresh air. Behind her, she could hear the quiet murmur of her team's voices, the gentle rustle of papers being organized, the soft sounds of a moment suspended between what was and what would be. Something had shifted today, not just for her, but for everyone who would walk through those courthouse doors in the future. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as the panel members filed back into the conference room. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the morning session. Where there had been skepticism, there was now gravity. Where there had been casual dismissal, there was focused attention. Judge Thompson and Judge Washington, who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the morning, now sat with straight backs and steady gazes. Their body language spoke volumes. They had made up their minds. Judge Khatri kept his eyes on his notes while Judge Patel drummed his fingers quietly on the table. Frank Denlow couldn't seem to stay still. He paced behind his chair, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor in an irregular rhythm. His earlier polished demeanor had cracked, revealing something raw and unsettled beneath. Every few steps he would grip the back of his chair, knuckles white, before resuming his restless movement. Liana sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table before her. She had removed her judge's robe for the afternoon session, wearing a crisp navy suit that somehow made her look even more authoritative. Tanya sat to her left, laptop open but screen dark, while Jordan maintained his position by the door, watching everything with keen eyes. The room fell silent as Judge Monroe cleared his throat. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the papers before him, though it seemed more a gesture of formality than necessity. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of considered judgment. "This tribunal has reached a preliminary decision." He paused, looking directly at Liana. Judge Liana Brooks acted within the scope of her duty, exercised appropriate internal authority, and exposed concerning systemic practices. A small release of breath could be heard from several corners of the room. Andrea Silva, who had remained for the afternoon session, pressed her hand to her heart. Clarence, standing near the back wall, nodded once, firmly. Monroe continued, his tone growing firmer. "We are recommending a separate inquiry into administrative conduct, beginning with Administrator Frank Denlow." Denlow's pacing stopped abruptly. He gripped his chair again, this time so hard it creaked under the pressure. The mask of professional composure he'd worn for decades seemed to slip entirely, revealing something desperate and angry underneath. "You don't understand what she's just done," he burst out, his voice carrying an edge of panic that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Monroe's response came swift and cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. "No, Mr. Denlow, we understand exactly." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Decades of carefully maintained culture, of systematic exclusion wrapped in polite language, of power preserved through quiet intimidation, all of it laid bare in that simple exchange. The panel members began gathering their materials. Judge Washington made a point of meeting Liana's eyes and giving her a small, firm nod. Judge Thompson was already on his phone, presumably contacting the chief judge about next steps. Outside the hearing room, the news was already spreading. Court staff gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed but excited tones. A few reporters had somehow gotten wind of the proceedings and were stationed near the courthouse steps, notebooks and cameras ready. Tanya checked her phone as they exited the conference room, her eyes widening slightly. She turned the screen toward Liana, showing her a breaking news alert from the local Justice Beat reporter. "Judge, accused of overreach, clears her name and exposes court-wide bias." The headline seemed to ripple through the courthouse in real time. Staff members looked at their phones, then at each other, then at Liana as she walked past. Some smiled openly now, no longer afraid to show support. Others looked worried, perhaps wondering what changes would come next. Clarence approached Liana as she gathered her things, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and vindication. 30 years, he said quietly. 30 years I watched and waited for someone to stand up. He shook his head slowly. "Thank you, Judge Brooks." Andrea Silva wiped tears from her eyes, her professional composure briefly cracking. "I never thought—" She started, then stopped, collecting herself. "I never thought anyone would believe us." Through it all, Liana maintained her calm demeanor, though there was a new lightness in her movements, a subtle release of tension she'd been carrying for weeks. She turned to her team, Tanya, Jordan, the witnesses who had risked their positions to speak truth, and saw in their faces the same understanding. This was just the beginning. The afternoon light streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating dust motes in the air and casting long shadows across the marble floors. In those shadows, the ghost of old power structures seemed to retreat, making way for something new, something more just to take their place. Denlow remained in the conference room, still gripping his chair, as staff members began to fill the hallways outside. The whispers and movements of the courthouse carried on around him, but he stood frozen, watching as the carefully constructed world he had built began to crumble. The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floors. A week had passed since the tribunal, and the building hummed with a different energy now. Gone were the hushed whispers and furtive glances. In their place was open conversation, direct eye contact, and a palpable sense of change that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the institution. Liana walked through the main entrance, noting how staff members nodded to her with newfound confidence. Some even offered small smiles of appreciation as she passed. The security checkpoint, once a place of tension for many attorneys of color, now had different officers manning the stations. They greeted everyone with the same professional courtesy, regardless of appearance, checking IDs with equal care and respect. As she passed the administration wing, her eyes fell on Denlow's former office. The space sat dark and empty, his nameplate conspicuously absent from the door. The cleaning crew had already removed the last traces of his 20-year tenure. The pretentious artwork, the carefully curated photos with influential figures, the leather chairs meant to intimidate visitors. All gone, leaving behind only blank walls and empty spaces waiting to be filled with something better. In the break room, clerks and administrative staff spoke freely about the state-level investigation that had officially begun. 2 investigators had set up in a conference room down the hall, methodically working through decades of records. Their presence, rather than causing anxiety, seemed to bring relief to many who had long carried silent burdens like stones in their pockets. "Did you hear?" a young clerk asked her colleague, not bothering to lower her voice as she stirred sugar into her coffee. They're going through everything: hiring practices, complaint procedures, even jury selection patterns. Nothing's off limits. About time, her colleague responded, straightening papers with decisive movements. My cousin tried to report harassment 3 years ago. They buried it so deep she quit law altogether. She couldn't sleep for months afterward. Liana made her way to her chambers where Tanya waited with a stack of morning updates. The young clerk's usual efficiency was tempered by an air of satisfaction as she handed over a particular memo, her dark eyes shining with quiet triumph. 2 judges submitted their resignations this morning, Tanya reported. Judge Harrison and Judge Meyer, both citing health and family reasons. She paused, allowing a small smile to break through her professional demeanor. Officers Peterson, Rodriguez, and Thompson also resigned. Same reasons given. Funny how health concerns can suddenly appear overnight. Liana read through the memo carefully. The language was standard bureaucratic fare, but between the lines lay a different story. All 5 had been prominently featured in the complaint logs, their names appearing repeatedly in Denlow's network of influence. Their departures, while dressed in polite terms, carried the weight of accountability that had been long overdue. There's something else, Tanya added, handing over another document with a slight hesitation. The State Judicial Oversight Board wants to meet with you, today. They wouldn't tell me what it's about, but they seemed eager. The meeting was set for early afternoon in one of the upper-floor conference rooms. Liana arrived to find 5 board members seated around a mahogany table, their expressions serious but not unfriendly. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air. The chair, Justice Regina Martinez, gestured for her to take a seat, her silver-streaked hair catching the light. Judge Brooks, Martinez began, what you uncovered here, and more importantly, how you handled it, has created ripples throughout the state judicial system. Other courthouses are conducting their own internal reviews. Staff members are coming forward with similar stories. Your courage has sparked something important. She slid a folder across the table. We've created a new position, Director of the Statewide Anti-Bias Oversight Committee. The role would have authority across every court in the state, with the power to investigate, implement changes, and ensure accountability at all levels of the system. Liana opened the folder, scanning the details. The position would have real teeth, direct reporting lines to the state Supreme Court, independent investigative authority, and the ability to implement binding policy changes. This wasn't just window dressing. It was structural reform with genuine power behind it. We want you to lead it, Martinez continued, leaning forward slightly. Your model here proved effective. We need someone who understands both the legal framework and the human cost of systemic bias, someone who knows how to build bridges while still holding the line on what matters. Liana looked up from the documents, her expression thoughtful. I'm not done here, she said carefully. This courthouse still needs steady leadership through this transition. There are people here who took risks. You'll have authority here too, another board member interjected, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face. Every courthouse in the state, including this one. Think bigger, Judge Brooks. What you did here could be replicated everywhere. The seeds you planted could grow across the entire system. The afternoon light shifted in the room as Liana considered the offer. She thought of Andrea Silva, forced to leave her job, her promising career derailed because she spoke truth to power. Of Clarence, documenting injustices for 30 years with patient, unwavering persistence. Of countless others who had faced similar battles in courthouses across the state, fighting alone against a system that wasn't built for them. I accept, she said finally, not out of ambition or desire for advancement, but from the same sense of duty that had driven her to become a judge in the first place. A commitment to justice that ran deeper than career or comfort. That evening, as the courthouse emptied for the weekend, Liana walked through the quiet halls. Her footsteps echoed off marble floors that had seen decades of history. Both justice and injustice served beneath these high ceilings. The building felt different now, as if the very stones were breathing easier. She paused at the entrance, running her hand along the smooth wooden railing, the same one she had been pushed against just days ago. The memory wasn't bitter anymore. It had become a catalyst, a turning point that transformed pain into purpose. The sound of a maintenance cart made her turn. Clarence approached, his movements unhurried as always, but his bearing somehow lighter, the permanent furrow between his brows less pronounced. "They finally see it?" he asked, stopping beside her, resting his weathered hands on the cart handle. Liana looked out at the courthouse steps where the last few staff members were heading home for the weekend, chatting easily with one another in the golden evening light. "They're starting to," she replied with cautious hope. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "One brick at a time," he said softly. "That's how you build something that lasts." The morning sun streamed through freshly cleaned windows, casting warm light across the courthouse's marble floors. 2 months had passed since Liana's appointment as director of the statewide Anti-Bias Oversight Committee, and she found herself back at the courthouse where it all began. The familiar halls felt different now, transformed not just by physical changes, but by a shift in atmosphere that was almost tangible. Her old courtroom had been repainted in soft, neutral tones that made the space feel more open and welcoming. Gone were the dark, imposing walls that had loomed over defendants and attorneys alike. The wooden benches gleamed with fresh polish, and new lighting fixtures cast an even, natural glow throughout the room. The changes weren't merely cosmetic. Posted prominently near the entrance, clearly visible to all who entered, were the new policies on conduct and profiling. The language was direct and unambiguous, leaving no room for the kind of coded discrimination that had once flourished in these halls. Each point was laid out in clear, accessible terms, with reporting procedures and accountability measures spelled out in detail. The bailiffs were all new faces, carefully selected and thoroughly trained under the reformed hiring practices. They maintained professional alertness while displaying none of the intimidating posturing that had once characterized courthouse security. Their uniforms were the same, but their demeanor was markedly different. Alert, but approachable, maintaining order through respect rather than fear. Liana observed all this from the doorway, noting how the atmosphere had shifted. Where tension had once hung heavy in the air, there was now a sense of calm purpose. The room no longer felt like a battlefield where justice struggled against prejudice. It felt like what it was always meant to be, a place where law and equity met on equal terms. As she moved through the building, she passed the training room where a group of new interns was receiving orientation. The diverse group of fresh faces listened intently as the instructor, a veteran clerk who had once been silent about the old system's failures, now spoke openly about ethical obligations and the importance of maintaining an inclusive environment. Near the security checkpoint, a young black woman in a crisp suit, clearly fresh from law school, approached with a stack of papers and a leather briefcase. As she reached for her ID, the papers shifted, and her identification card slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. For a brief moment, tension flickered across her face, the kind of tension Liana recognized all too well, the instinctive preparation for an interaction that could turn unpleasant. But the new bailiff, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, simply bent down and retrieved the card. His movement was casual, natural, containing none of the power play that such moments had often become in the past. He handed the ID back with a genuine smile. "Welcome, counselor," he said, his tone carrying the perfect balance of professional courtesy and human warmth. The young woman's shoulders relaxed visibly as she accepted her ID, a small smile of relief and appreciation crossing her face. She moved through the checkpoint with dignity intact, her steps confident as she headed toward the elevators. Liana watched this interaction from an alcove, unseen by either participant. A smile, small but genuine, broke through her usually composed expression. This was what change looked like. Not in grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but in these simple moments of human dignity being preserved and protected. The main hall, with its soaring ceiling and historical portraits, had always been an imposing space. Now, among the stern-faced judges of decades past, a new portrait commanded attention. The painting showed Judge Liana Brooks in her judicial robes, seated at the bench with hands folded before her. The artist had captured something essential in her expression, the direct, unflinching gaze that had stared down systemic injustice, tempered by the compassion that drove her fight for reform. The portrait's placement was deliberate, positioned where staff and visitors couldn't miss it. Below the frame, a polished brass plate bore the inscription, "The 2-minute verdict. Judge Liana Brooks, Defender of Justice, Reformer of Systems." The title referenced that pivotal morning when she had returned to her courtroom in full robes, 2 minutes after being escorted out, to deliver a verdict that would ultimately shake the entire system. Liana stood before the portrait, taking in not just the image but what it represented. The painting wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had documented abuses in silence, every attorney who had faced discrimination, every defendant who had encountered bias. It was about Clarence's 30 years of careful notes, Andrea Silva's courage in coming forward, and countless others who had contributed to this change. She lingered for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had led to this point. The portrait would remain here long after she moved on, serving not just as a reminder of what had happened, but as a promise to everyone who entered these halls. Justice in this building would be truly blind to everything except the facts and the law. Then she turned, her head held high, and walked down the corridor. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing with a different meaning now. These weren't the sounds of anger or defiance anymore. They were the steady rhythm of legacy, the continuing footsteps of progress moving forward. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Liana, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.